Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find our friends at Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. To the very essence of today's book, I am going to keep the introduction succinct. I'm going to literally get to the point. If your goal is to have and deliver a clear point, today's book is an invaluable guide. No matter who you are, how you're communicating, what you're saying, or who you're communicating to, you need a point to create impact. Without a point, everything you say is pointless. This book is not about general communication. It's about a specific element of communication. It is about point training. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of that book, who kindly asked me to cover and endorse this book, The Language of Leadership, and endorse the book, which I did. And we were going to cover it today. And then what he does is he goes and re-releases this at a 10-year anniversary. We welcome the author of Get to the Point, Joel Schwartzberg. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Aidan. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. And we had Joel on a long time ago, actually, shortly after the release of Get to the Point. This one I'm holding. There's a new release out. I have it on my Kindle. That's the one I prepared for today. But the reason, Joel, I wanted to share it was I was thinking about the curse of Cassandra, the famous Greek myth of Cassandra, who was gifted with knowing the future, but nobody could understand her. She talked gibberish to people. And that's not an insult to many innovators out there, but oftentimes an innovator knows the future, has a sense of where the future is going, but cannot deliver the point succinctly. And like you say in the book, it's like drinking water from a hose pipe for the listener. So I thought that was an extremely important thing. And every year around New Year's, I release a show that's usually around self-development. So either around the body or the mind or something like communication. So that's why I thought this was such an important point to get across to people. And I wondered what your thoughts were about that, about innovation.
I think this applies directly to innovation because whether it's innovation or revolution or new technology or a breakthrough campaign, how does your team learn about it? Through communication. We haven't yet developed a telepathy system, and we're not using performance art. We are communicating, especially leadership, through email, through slides, through presentations. And so it comes back to some foundational elements, as foundational as Aristotle. How do you make sure your audience receives your message? And just because we have more platforms than ever, it doesn't mean we can disregard or dismiss some of the basic rules of communicating. We just change some of the tactics we use to best leverage each of those platforms, including AI.
You mentioned the platforms, and there's a lot of water under the bridge since we did the first episode, which was it's BC, before COVID.
Mhm.
And since then, we've had an explosion in remote work, explosion in tools like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc. And therefore, communication becomes ever more important. And to add to that, new generations into the workforce who, whether they know it or not, work to different operating systems of communication. I wondered what you saw change over that period of time.
I think over a long period of time, I have seen some progress and some advance. At the start, I think people thought everything that worked in a room could work in a Zoom. But then they learned that when they weren't paying attention, or they didn't seem visually interested, or they weren't leveraging chat, that money was left on the table. And we're not using this as effectively or efficiently as we could. One of the things I learned recently is that on your team, there are extroverts and introverts. And we need to pay attention to the introverts in particular. Otherwise, we'll have the same voices giving feedback again and again. Well, introverts don't like to speak in public. They don't like even to unmute so much and to spotlight their voice. But you know what they enjoy doing or what they're comfortable doing? Chatting. So one of the things that Zoom or Teams allows us to do or allows them to do is respond in a way that's comfortable for them. And if they're comfortable, they're going to say more and they're going to say more meaningful things. I find chat in particular in a lot of different ways a very useful mechanism that only exists in the virtual environment and doesn't really exist in the live IRL environment. So I think we've come to a place where we recognize there are actually benefits to using Zoom. It's not just a break glass in case of emergency. It's its own platform, just like video, just like Slack, just like internal chat. These are different ways we can communicate and we could leverage each one uniquely.
I was telling you off air, one of my practices is to wear a pin, and I haven't been doing it recently. And I wanted to explain to our audience because I got a few emails. Why aren't you wearing the pin anymore? I changed studios, and my new studio is really warm, so I don't wear a jacket anymore. And I sometimes wear a t-shirt now or just a shirt, so it's difficult to wear a pin. So to make up for that, I still have the pins. I have loads of them. I have this one that I've been dying to use for this episode, and it's an exclamation mark, literally perfect for this show. Get to the point. So let's start with the problem to get to the point. The book is beautifully succinct, as you would expect for a book about get to the point. But you recall your sixth grade project on the neutron bomb as an example of where this can go wrong.
Right. When I gave speeches, or even when I wrote reports in school, when I was in grammar school, this is the assignment. Write the pros and cons of this. Compare and contrast these two things, or write a 5-paragraph essay. And what's wrong about all those things is we weren't training, or I wasn't trained, to make points. I was only trained to describe things. So when I gave that speech on the neutron bomb, or an even better example, when I was in 5th or 6th grade, I wrote a report about the Supreme Court. And I wrote about the history of the Supreme Court, and I wrote about how many members are on it, how long it's been in effect, how one becomes a justice. And I turned it in, and my teacher said, "This is very descriptive, and you defined the Supreme Court, but I noticed you didn't mention any cases." And really, it's about the Supreme Court cases where they become relevant. So this is where I think my mind was at least prepared with the understanding of, oh, it's not about just describing something. It's not just a Wikipedia page. You're actually making an argument, as we used to say in debate, but a proposition, an assertion, a suggestion, a recommendation. And this is the heart of making points. And I recognized it later when I began coaching. And the people are coaching, yeah, they were doing great gestures. They had good volume. They had good speed. And when I asked them for what the point was, what the one thing they wanted their audience to take away was, it would take them 10 minutes. And Aidan, I like to say, we're very used to this word point. We hear all the time, get to the point. What was the point of all this? And we've called it different things in the past. When we were in college, it was called a thesis. In PR, it's called a key message. Sometimes in leadership training, it's called an elevator pitch. My wife's 4th grade language arts class, it's called a so what. So we're used to this idea of making a point. But I like the word point because it's something we're accustomed to, and it really drives to the heart of the idea of what you want to leave behind.
I worked for a leader before, and she had this great line. She used to say, every slide in your pitch deck should be marry me because. That's what her line was. But I mention that because it is such an important skill for salespeople. And I know, Joel, you travel the world teaching and training teams all over the world. You mentioned you're going to Mumbai, which is incredible to see the wise leaders there that understand that investing in their sales teams or any of their leaders to teach them this content is so valuable. And you say here the error that you just mentioned there with you. Now, we'll forgive you as a 6th grader, but when you're an executive, I don't blame the executives, Joe, because the same thing that we see here is what we see in innovation, where if you don't know the content, if you don't know it exists, how are you going to get better if the organization doesn't invest in you? And you say in the book, for example, a salesperson will describe their inventory, but never say, this product will make you more successful. Activists, you say, who detail their initiatives, but don't say, this campaign will save lives. Designers who display beautiful images, but don't say, this branding will inspire customer loyalty. Business leaders who share their project plans, but don't say, this endeavor will revolutionize our industry. They're the things you're trying to extract from people. But if they don't know, they don't know.
You and I, and probably every single person in your audience, has seen this presentation. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to tell you about this idea. The first thing we're going to do is talk about the history of the idea. Then we're going to talk about how we came up with the idea and how we're rolling it out. We're going to talk about the investment we're going to make in the idea. We're going to talk about the people in the idea. And then we're going to look at some milestones we hope to get to in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, and in 2 years. Any questions? And one person, and that sounds normal to a lot of people. Yeah, all right. But one person may raise their hand and say, yeah, why are we doing this? You never got to that. And the example you gave was definitely a client I had who sold hats and calendars and brochures. And she described each one with specificity. This hat will never get crushed. This brochure will never get wet. This pin is actually a magnet, so it'll never ruin your clothes. But then I said, you know what I never heard? Like you said, if you buy my products, you will be more successful. And that was her point. But she was too busy describing her inventory. And you're right. People don't know this. They don't know that they're being pointless. And that's why they ramble. That's why they need 3 times as long, because they're searching for that thing, but they don't know what it is that's missing.
I've learned so much from your book and I've put it into practice over the years. And I also have a Joel Schwartzberg check over at the end of every article I write. And I start off actually by writing out what my point I'm making here. And we may as well say it because I'm going to bring it up now. One of the things I do use AI for is I don't use it to write the articles, but I do it to question me. And I'll go, what's my point with this article?
Exactly.
Why would this be relevant to a business person, etc.? That's one of the things that has changed for you since the first edition.
Yeah, I had to address AI. And if you go to LinkedIn, at least in my algorithmic journey, everyone's talking about it. And a lot of people, unfortunately, have separated into 2 extreme camps. One is it's coming, give into it, let it do everything. The other is not on my deathbed. It would never use AI. It's the death of thought. And really, it's in the middle because it's how you use it. And I love, Aidan, how you described you using it as if I were next to you and saying, what's my point? Was my point clear? Was this point emphasized enough so that people will take it away? Now, I'm writing an article for Toastmasters magazine, of all things, that's going to come out next year about the ways I think people should use AI based on the biggest faults of AI. And of course, one of them is accuracy, because we know all about that. It even says on ChatGPT, this may not be 100% accurate. But one of the other biggest things is authenticity. What do people complain about AI? It doesn't sound like me. It sounds like a version of me that's very adjective friendly, that's very redundant, that's very verbose. To get to that version of authenticity, really the bottom line is to look at your AI output and ask, is there anything in here that if I said it aloud wouldn't sound like my voice? Is there anything in here that's emphasizing the wrong thing or misprioritizing this? And is there anything in here where it's so proud of its own wordage? And I call this, there's a real world, a grandiloquence. It loves grandiloquence, a fancy way of saying things that it gets in the way of the message. Here's the really funny thing, Aidan. I wrote this with these qualities to look out for: authenticity, mispriority, grandiloquence, redundancy, inaccuracy. And then I discovered something unique that maybe has been talked about a little bit. And that is that there's one thing AI wants to do that's more important to it than accuracy. And that is to make you happy. It wants to serve you, and it's built that way. And I'd love to tell you this quick story to test it. I brought up ChatGPT and I said, what is your favorite color? And it said red. And I said, my favorite color is blue. And it said, yeah, blue is pretty good. And I said, I think blue is the best. And it said, blue's pretty good, and so is red. And I said, I want your favorite color to be blue, not red. And it said, Okay, my new favorite color is blue, starting now. Wow. Now that was what you call a low stakes situation, but you can imagine the higher stakes of that. And that's going on all over the place where it really wants to be your cheerleader, your yes person. And that's the prime directive. So that's probably one of the biggest things you have to be careful about when it's going to do something wrong or use a different voice or say something inaccurate because it thinks that that's what you want to hear.
I don't know if you saw the show The Boys on Amazon. Have you seen? You're nodding. Okay.
I've seen it a little bit.
So
Yeah.
you know the character, the main character who, let's just say, is a presidential type character, Homelander,
Right.
head
Wow.
superhero. At one stage, he gets angry and he's like going, "Oh my God, I'm surrounded by these yes people." But what he's talking about are sycophants. And the sycophant
Sycophant.
is
That's the word.
exactly
Yeah.
how I think of AI. But I've, again, with my AI, I use it actually for training. So I feed into it every day what I've eaten, my fasting, my training sessions,
Hmm.
etc. And I tell it to be a pain in the ass gym instructor. And it is, and it's
Hmm.
really hard on me.
Yeah.
Like, so it'll be like
Yeah.
going, "Whoa, Aidan, you shouldn't have had that carb." And I'm like going, "Oh, whoa, okay." And it's very annoying, but you want that type of accountability from it. And again, you can do this, but it's not nice to hear that, to get that type of feedback.
I will say that we talk about jobs being lost. I think that everyone is afraid of their job being lost, and these are writers and editors. They should take on the skills of prompting and output editing. Those are going to be critical skills because everyone seems to agree, or at least everyone who cares seems to agree that the AI output by itself is not enough. It's flawed. And you correct that both in the specificity of your prompt, like you said, be a hard ass gym coach, and looking for these things, authenticity, grandiloquence, verbosity in the output and voice. If editorialists are trained in those things, their jobs will be valuable because that is a valuable add on and second lens to what AI
And we're
contributes.
going to come back and share some of these ways to avoid verbosity and
Mhm.
eloquence, etc. So we'll, we'll come back to that. I learned a new word today. But I just wanted to flag something, Joel, and I think this is really important, and you call this out, that presenting is a skill and not a talent. And the reason I
Right.
share that is I think where it becomes ambiguous is where people mistake being comfortable with speaking in front of crowds is being a good speaker.
Mhm.
And maybe sometimes so does the speaker, because they're like going, "Hey, I don't mind. I can wing it." And you say,
Right.
"For the love of God, don't wing it."
Yeah. Yeah. That's like nails on a chalkboard to me when people say they can wing it. Not to throw lawyers under the bus, but sometimes when my clients are lawyers or subject matter experts, there's this presumption that because I know this issue inside and out, therefore, ergo, I can speak to it as if those came from the same place in our brains, which we know they don't. That's why when we practice a presentation, it's not just about thinking it out, it's about saying it. Our mouth can speak, but it's rather dumb. Our brain is smart, but it's mute. So they need to work together. But yeah, everybody needs a point. If somebody rambles, back to your point about this being a skill, not a talent, if someone is rambling, it doesn't mean they were born a bad public speaker. It means that they don't know their point. And I'll tell you the truth, I teach third through seventh graders now in an after school program in my community. So these are 8-year olds. And I am resisting and rejecting their inclination to write it out word for word and memorize it, even for third graders. And I'm getting a little pushback for this, but they understand what it means to have an opinion. This is what I say to the third graders. I say, if someone asks you how good this new superhero movie was, do you go home, write that review, memorize it, come back, and then from your memory, tell them what you wrote about that superhero movie? No, that never happens. You just tell them, you make your point to them. And so they understand this idea of making a point, having limited notes or an outline to remind themselves of the things they might forget. I'm using very simple language here. And we start with smaller presentations and speeches and work to larger. But it does prove to me that everybody, regardless of your challenge, regardless how, where, or why you were born, can understand the concept of moving a point from their head to their audience's head.
There's a whole section on making points in speeches, and you say the biggest reason not to write a speech is that you don't want to have to read it. And reading forces you
Right.
to look down often, and you lose eye contact with the audience there, and almost like an energy contact with the audience. And also, this is really important, that our brains process writing and reading differently. So it almost confuses the audience.
And it confuses the brain. The brain makes this assumption, oh, we're reading now, so I don't need to turn on the passion part of the brain. I don't need to turn on the excitement part of the brain because we're reading, right? So the brain's not going to know that. This is why, and I've seen this over and over again, so I totally believe this. If you read, it robs you, unless you are a fantastic actor or actress, it robs you of your passion because your brain says, I'm reading. And that's why it's dull. Now, let's not even get into memorization because that is so perilous. But that is the same thing as reading. You're just reading it from the passages in your brain that you memorized versus reading it off a piece of paper. And what the kids think of it as, I ask them, what's the difference between reading a speech to your audience and writing an essay and reading that aloud? Are those the same things? And they generally say no. And then that begins the discussion on what it means to make a point. So yeah, the speechwriters hate when I say this, but it's really not about the words. It's about how you convey that point authentically and effectively to your audience so that and this is important too, because we often use a word like impact or change, but those are broad words. So what are we talking about when we talk about impact in an audience? I love how a marketing firm put it, and I'm borrowing it from them, but they put it in this language. If I nail this presentation, if I write this email effectively or this Slack message, they will feel, think, or do. Feel, think, or do. If you affect that, you win. Even if you are imperfect, even if you don't sound like Michelle Obama, even if you lost that one word, you are more of a delivery person than a performer. I always stress the difference between performance and presentation. You are not a performer. You are a deliverer. And so long as you deliver that point, you succeed. But if people come away from my presentation and say, oh man, Joel, he was so funny. He was interesting. He was charismatic. Can't wait to see him again. Yeah, so what did you learn from that session? I don't know, something about points, but he was great. I failed. That's an epic fail because my job was not to make me look good or to make people think of me as a great public speaker, but to receive my point. So it makes them more effective communicators.
Speaking of actors and speaking of actresses, I thought we'd do something pretty cool. I read in preparation, not just your books and the new edition, but an Inc. article that you wrote. And the Inc. article was about a brilliant speech from Demi Moore. And you mentioned how you can lose impact and how the effectiveness of language, and language is really the operating system for the human mind. So the language you constantly iterate to yourself and your constant monkey brain chatter is so effective to you as well. And if you can change that language, you can change how you then perform in the world. And I share that because there's so much more in this speech than just a brilliant speech by Demi Moore. There's how she was affected by a seed planted in her mind that actually was a toxic one as well. So I'm going to share that for our audience here. And then Joel is going to deconstruct it for us and tell us why it's such an effective speech.
Oh, wow. I really wasn't expecting that. I'm just in shock right now. I've been doing this a long time, like over 45 years. And this is the first time I've ever won anything as an actor. And I'm just so humbled and so grateful. 30 years ago, I had a producer tell me that I was a popcorn actress. And at that time, I made that mean that this wasn't something that I was allowed to have, that I could do movies that were successful, that made a lot of money, but that I couldn't be acknowledged. And I bought in and I believed that. And that corroded me over time to the point where I thought a few years ago that maybe this was it. Maybe I was complete. Maybe I've done what I was supposed to do. And as I was at a low point, I had this magical, bold, courageous, out of the box, absolutely bonkers script come across my desk called The Substance. And the universe told me that you're not done. And I am so grateful to Corley for trusting me to step in and play this woman, for Margaret for being the other half of me that I couldn't have done without, for looking out for me, to the people who've been with me for over 30 years, Kevin Uvain, Jason Weinberg, everybody at CAA, Untitled, Lead, all of the people who stood by me, especially the people who've believed in me when I haven't believed in myself. And I'll just leave you with one thing that I think this movie is imparting is in those moments when we don't think we're smart enough or pretty enough or skinny enough or successful enough or basically just not enough. I had a woman say to me, just know you will never be enough, but you can know the value of your worth if you just put down the measuring stick. And so today I celebrate this as a marker of my wholeness and of the love that is driving me, and for the gift of doing something I love and being reminded that I do belong. Thank you so much.
A bit of a tearjerker for me. I think that's such an effective speech. Not just, it probably is because of her point, and it's probably just because there's so much meaning in it of how the words of someone else can inspire or restrict somebody's growth. And there's so much in that. I just absolutely love the point. But Joel, I'd love you to deconstruct it, as I said. Tell us why it was so effective.
Sure. And to tell you the truth, I love to use examples from people from whom you don't always expect speeches. I don't think I'm going to make a lot of progress by showing you JFK or Ronald Reagan or Martin Luther King, because we already hold those people in such esteem, and there is a strong focus on words there. Here, we're used to a lot of thank yous, a lot of blather, a lot of things that aren't interesting. And I think a lot of celebrities actually goof this up because they don't come prepared with a point. They may come prepared with a lot of words, but I see a lot of epic fails because they don't make a point. Now here, Demi Moore, she had a point, and she also had a story. She wanted to talk about how she was able to advance from this caricature of her as a popcorn actress and become and realize for herself and to convey to others that she could do more. And the point was so compact, and she used words like a popcorn actress, and she was able to summarize it, that it really came through. But let's actually unpack this. So the first thing that I think she did right was she ditched the script. Now, it may be possible that she memorized it because she's an actress and she could do that. Most of us can't memorize something and say it authentically. But it gave her, as you said before, more eye contact and more authenticity. When she did thank people, she didn't just say a bunch of names, which would, not interest us at all. For each person, she talked about why. So she talked about why Margaret Qualley was the other half of me that I could have done without, or she thanked the director for trusting her. Her story is so compelling, and she leveraged it that way. Although that doesn't mean that any story from us has to be cinematic. But her story was about her decades-long narrative, like I said, of being labeled as this popcorn actress. What it did was that story made her relatable, because we've all been stereotyped. We all might have been limited by someone else's sense of us. She also talked about impact, not just events. When she was called a popcorn actress, she talked about how that hurt her, how that hurt her self-esteem. Finally, she ended with a call to action. She said that for those of us who feel that we may not be enough, which is a lot of people, know that we need to have faith in ourselves. We need to celebrate our wholeness. And really, it was a story about transformation. But it was what I always tell my students is, don't forget what this means to you. why this matters to you, how this can help you. And she did that by saying, I hope you learn from my transformation so that you too can raise your sense of what you can achieve and your own ambition.
And genuinely, one of the reasons I do the show, because as I said to you at the start, there's so many brilliant people out there who struggle with the communication of a point, or communicate their brilliant
Mhm.
ideas, or even their self-talk, like we saw with Demi Moore there, that it's just toxic and holding them back from a life worth living, really. So it's why I really like doing these type of shows. January, the root of January is this word Janus, which is the Greek god of new beginnings or doorways. And I love that as just a mental model for January, as a chance to just get going and lean into these things. So just a moment on this, because I really wanted to double click on what is a point, because
Mhm.
again, we can get lost on this and we can think maybe the title or the topic or the lack of uniqueness is the point, but actually you say it's something totally different. So I really love to hammer, if there's nothing else we get across from today's episode, it's what the heck is a point?
I often say that in my training. If you got nothing else out of this, let's discuss how we define a point. First, let's talk about what a point is not, because this is critical. If we're not making points, what are we making? Topics is number one. Sometimes categories, sometimes catchphrases, themes, observations, ideas, titles. We sometimes fall in love with titles. But a point is, like I said, a proposal, an argument, an assertion. And there are two exercises, if you don't mind my sharing. One was in the original version of the book, and that's called the I Believe That test. But another one that's just as useful that I added in the new second edition is called the XY test. They're both very easy. The I Believe test goes like this. You take what you think is your point to a colleague, to a partner, to a vendor, to a customer, to a colleague. And, it's one sentence. It's the one idea you want them to take away about your differentiation, your value. You put the words, I believe that, in front of it, and you ask yourself one question. Is what I have now a complete sentence? Would it impress my elementary school teachers as a complete sentence, not a fragment or a run-on? If it is a complete sentence, then you are on your way to making a strong point. If it is not, you need to reimagine it so that it is. And let me just give you one example. I believe that podcasting is not a complete sentence. So podcasting is not a point. I believe that the importance of podcasting, the value of podcasting, the future of podcasting, not complete sentences. So none of those are points. The value of podcasting, the future of podcasting. Remember, we're using I believe that as a test, not necessarily using those words. But when we say, I believe that podcasting is the best way to reach our Generation Z audience, that's a complete sentence. And that is the kind of point that makes you go, okay, tell me more. I'd like to reach a millennial audience, and I know they like podcasts. Let's get to the nitty gritty of using podcasts to reach our millennial audience. And the second test, which I just added, really kind of brings us into an algebraic function, an equation. It's called the XY test. And basically, it's this phrase. If we do X, Y, the letter Y, will result. So in the phrase, podcasting will enable us to reach this Generation Z audience, the X is podcasting. The Y is reaching this particular audience. The teacher might see it the same way. I'm using this very specific multicultural curriculum so that more kids will be able to graduate. Now, an X without a Y sounds like, I want to use a multicultural curriculum. To which someone said, well, that sounds cool, but why? Now, a Y without an X sounds like, I want to get more of these kids to graduate. That sounds awesome. How are we going to do that? So that's why you need both X, the mechanism, to effect Y, the outcome.
I thought that was such an important one. We've all had that colleague who comes across with great credibility, great gravitas, and oftentimes we don't know why. We just go, that person, Joel, is great in meetings, isn't he? Or he's so wise, etc. And again, back to that point I said about the Demi Moore effect. You want people to be able to do that themselves, to impart their brilliant knowledge. Like you said, introverts. neurodiverse people
Right.
are often a bit more shy in those kind of surroundings. But if they have these tools and they can just deliver the point, at the very least, they don't have to do all the fluffy bits around that, but be able to deliver the point effectively.
There's something you said is stuck in my brain earlier about sales teams. The truth of the matter to me is everyone at an organization is in sales. Everyone, not just the sales team. Because if you're not selling a product, you are selling an idea. Maybe a micro idea for that week. It may be a huge campaign for the year or for the quarter. In either case, just like you wouldn't just share news about a product, you shouldn't just share details about an idea. You should be selling both. So what does it mean to sell an idea? That is to make a point.
Brilliant, Joel. And there's a last point on that, which is, so the I believe test, there's the XY test, and then there's the Truism Buster test, which is just the cherry on top.
Yeah, the truism test is because I found a lot of people who were passing the I believe that test, but were stating truisms. Our idea is new. You know, the sun is hot, snow is white. I believe that politicians sometimes don't tell the full truth. These are things that are true on their face, which means you don't need to give a presentation about them. We assume them to be true. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. So when you make your point and it passes the I believe that test, you could say that I believe that a lot of people are using podcasts. I believe that this organization was founded in 1898. But that's not a compelling point. And in fact, it fails the XY test. The ways that you can fix something that's a truism, or at least root out, understand that it's a truism, are asking two questions. One, is there a feasible counterpoint to this? If someone could reasonably argue the opposite, then it's not a truism. Or if it's something your audience is unaware of that you need to educate them, then it is not a truism because you're giving them new information. So just be careful, because a sales pitch could start with, hey, did you know we were founded in 1899? And by the way, this has so many features. And then the client might leave by thinking, hey, did you know that company was founded in 1899? So be careful about what you're saying. Make sure you're putting mustard on, which is what I like to say. You're emphasizing the true point. You could say that as many times as you want, because no one will come back to you later and say, hey, Joel was great, but you know what? He made his point too many times. But that doesn't happen because the point is the gift. The point is the one thing you need to get on your bicycle and deliver from point A to point B. And if you do that, you succeed, because that's the goal, just like it was for Demi Moore.
Before we sharpen our points, and we'll tell our audience how to do that, I thought a really important thing was to call out. We're told to do this. We're told to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. But when I read this book, and particularly the second time, actually, it was tell them the point, reiterate the point, back up the point, sharpen the point, deliver the point, and then tell them the point. So it's actually a different lens to see it. And a couple of things, watch out, you say here, and I've been guilty of this. And actually, I realize why I've been guilty of this. It depends on how you're introduced sometimes, or sometimes if you're speaking at an event or running a workshop, you'll be introduced as, actually, you know what, this is Aidan. We'll let him do his own introduction. And in that moment, you lose the opportunity to deliver a point. Or if you deliver it, it's almost you deliver this important point, and then you have to kind of back out and go, let me tell you a bit about myself. But from reading this, I was like, I can still get around that. I just need to sharpen my intro a little bit better.
Yeah. In fact, I used to begin years ago, I used to start with about 2 or 3 minutes of my background, why I was credentialed and why I have the reputation or the qualification to speak to you today. And Aristotle would call that ethos. But the thing is, they already chose me. I might even be in a program. Somebody probably introduced me. I don't need to spend my time with that. That's like saying I started in such and such year. So I want to start with my point. And in fact, I got a challenge once from someone who was opening a conference and introducing speakers. And he said, I don't have a point because it's really the speaker's points. I'm just introducing them. To which I said, well, isn't it your job to explain to the audience why you chose them, why they are relevant to this conference, and what you hope and believe they can get out of that presentation. Just like you said, when you introduce a panel, you want to do the introducing for a lot of technical reasons, because you don't want them to go on and on. It could be all mess, but you're doing your job as a moderator to tell the audience why this topic and these experts are relevant. So I think that's true. And I do like what you said about that old idea. Tell them what you can tell them, tell them what you told them. Let's, channel Simon Sinek a little bit here by saying it's more about the why, not the what. Start with a hook that introduces the point. Tell the point. Get into your first idea, which supports your point. Your second idea, which supports your point. Your third idea, which supports your point. Your charts and your data, which support your point. Your stories, which support your point. And by reinforcing your point, make your point the very last thing you said. Because at the end of the day, the ball game is about delivering that point, not delivering perfect words or being seen as a great presenter.
One of the things I definitely benefit from, Joel, is almost doing the show for 10 years now, a decade long doing the show, but also writing about it and continually letting those ideas marinate. And then when I am MC or an event or I'm a keynote speaker, it looks like it's effortless, but it's like so much knowledge compounded. But to your point as well, I can then introduce the speaker very, very differently than any normal MC would. And by that, I mean some MC who's just reading, oh, this is Joel Schwartzberg, and
life story.
spelling your name wrong and not knowing your book titles, all this kind of stuff.
Oh.
But I say that for a reason. There's a couple of things that happen at events, and maybe we'll turn the spotlight on that for a moment. Let's think about our audience here. So most of them aren't professional speakers, but maybe called to be on a panel sometimes. And sometimes you're called on a panel and you're trying to make a point, and then you get sidelined by somebody else. And sometimes they're trying to hijack you. Sometimes they're trying to make their point through you or trying to compete with your point. And you give advice in the book on how to deal with that.
Yeah, this was new for the second edition because one of the top questions I would get during the Q&A session of the training is, I am interrupted all the time. And it may be a panel, but usually it's just a meeting. What do I do that doesn't make it awkward, doesn't make me seem mad? And you see a lot of this on social media too. But this is the trick that I learned. I forget where I learned it, honestly. I'd love to give credit for it. But this is what I recommend. When someone interrupts you, let them finish their sentence. Don't interrupt back. That creates awkwardness. You don't want to go after them, hey, because that makes everyone feel awkward. But you don't want to just sort of recede into your corner and not having made your point. You need to make your point because you are a subject matter expert, whatever you're doing in that meeting. So here's what you do. You let that person finish their sentence. Then you thank them. As much as it hurts to do it, you thank them for their point. You may even say, well, that's pretty wise, or I'll have to think about that later. But I just wanted to finish what I was saying. Thank you for that input. That's very interesting. I just want to make sure everyone understands the point I was making, which is, and what that does is it settles everybody because you then just complimented the person who interrupted you. So there's no weirdness. We're all friends here, and you still get to finish your point. And I know it's a very tactical thing, but I just loved it.
Another really important one, and we're going to come to sharpen your point in a moment, but is your endings. And I realized this one, I could foresee this when I ran an event, the Reinvention Summit this year. At the end of my keynote, I had to then send people for coffee. And firstly, there was going to be like a 5-minute piece played before coffee. And I was like, my ending was actually quite making a point. It was dramatic and it was a call to action. And then I had to go, okay. And I just gave it a beat, as you say. So give it a beat and then go, let's go to coffee. Because to have a new MC on to actually announce that just felt awkward or just like a waste of a couple of minutes. But really, I probably should have. And your endings are really important. This is my way of introducing endings. Endings are so important, and they're not just a throwaway idea. For example, this medication will save lives. And let's all go for coffee.
Right. Yeah, there's this research on something called primacy and recency. And these are the two zones of where you get your audiences the most of their attention. And it's also the zone of memorability. They'll remember the first part and the second part. The first part, because that's not competing with anything else you said, you just started. The recency part is because it's the last thing you hear. So you don't want the last thing be, all right, now it's time for Q&A. All right, now let's bring up the next speaker. Now let's have lunch. Or I'm going to end with this quote by someone who died 100 years ago that I thought was kind of funny. Really, that's the last thing you want people. So you're ruining that opportunity for recency. But you alluded to the fix, which is pause, let it sink in. When it sinks in, it becomes part of people's memory. But don't just pause because you know to put a pause there or for a break. Let's understand that your audience needs time to process everything you say. We often think the moment it escapes our mouths, they got it and they could write it down, but it's not true. It's fast for us because we've been practicing this for weeks. We've been thinking about it for months. We perfected the words. We perfected the PowerPoint. They are hearing it for the very first time. So they need to listen to it, hear it, digest it, apply it. Is this relevant for me? Should I bring this up at a next meeting? Should I tweet this? Should I think more about this? Should I make this part of my goals? Meanwhile, the speaker is about 7 sentences down the road, 7 sentences you never heard because you were busy processing that point. So at the very end, where you're taking the last opportunity, you're taking advantage of recency to make your point, stop. Count to 4 or 5 in your head. No one's going to think you fell asleep. So you let that sink in, almost to say, let's give me time to let them write it down. That way they'll remember it. And, I don't talk about a lot of tactics in my training. I mean, I don't talk about 25, I talk about 5, but one of them is definitely pausing, because we often think pausing is for a dramatic effect, and it is. But pausing is critical to helping our audience process and digest what we're saying. It is also critical for helping us contemplate what we're about to say. So our mind scripts our mouth and our mouth can say it. Because often we lead with our mouths, blah, 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 blah. And our mind is like, wait, I'd like to make sense of that. I'd like to put those words in a particular order. I'd like to swap out that word for this word, but I can't do that unless you give me time to script you. So that's the beauty of pausing also.
When I finished rugby, I was a co-commentator. So in sports games, the co-com, so you have the commentator who covers all the action, and the co-com is there to come in for a bit of color every so often. And
Right.
I was so bad. The first one, I remember the guy, and he was he was a South African guy, very animated, and he's like going, wow, what an amazing score, Aidan, what do you think? And he turns to me and I'm like, going, yeah, it was a really good score. He scored in the corner, right? So it went on, and he's like, the play went on, there was a breaking play, and he's going, let me just give you a tip, Aidan. He said, when you're about to speak, take a deep breath and then just deliver it as a breath. And your volume will raise, your articulation will be better, and it will stop you saying or filler word.
Absolutely.
And it was a brilliant piece of advice I've carried it everywhere with myself. So the breath to avoid the filler word, but also to just deliver with impact. There's 2 things in there. One is the breath to avoid filler words. The other is the importance of volume. And I'm talking to the ladies who listen to the show. Half of our audience are female. And what I find a lot with many women is they will say to me, it sounds like I'm being aggressive if I raise my voice in a meeting or sometimes when I'm speaking. And I'll go, absolutely not. That's not the case. And if somebody thinks that, they're the problem.
Right. Yeah. And I hesitate before using that phrase, raise your voice, because in school we learned that was like yelling at someone. So let's talk about raising your volume, by which we also mean raising your energy. If you actually raise your volume, you'll have more energy. And so when you do that, you are not only more audible, which is obvious. Oh, I need to reach the people in the back of the room. But it increases your impression of authority, of credibility, of confidence, of subject matter knowledge, of leadership. And I don't just say that because I assume it. I've run this particular test over 10 years in all of my trainings. Here's what happens. people share their points, and I ask one or two or three people, and they're men and women, and I ask them to say it again, but say it with a volume that is uncomfortably loud, weirdly loud, awkwardly loud. Don't scream or shout. Just do it at a volume at which you would probably never do it. And they're like, okay. And then they speak like you and I are speaking now, like this, as opposed to like this. And this is what I think. And then I ask the audience and their participants and their colleagues, what changed in your impression of that person as a result of the volume? And here's what they say. That person sounded more confident, more excited, more authoritative. And here's my favorite one, more assertive. And being more assertive is very valuable because that's what you want to do with a point. Now, to elaborate on what you just said, Aidan, some people may come into the room and feel like because you are louder, you are coming across as aggressive or shrill even. That is not about you. That is about them. That is about sexism, and it may happen, but your job is always to speak up, even when their job is to grow up. So I really recommend people do that. Now, some people attach volume to a male normative behavior that comes from long ago when only men were in charge and they were loud and they were confident. And so they try to distance from that. And that is an antiquated point of view. We do want to get away from that. So if it's helpful for you to think of it as energy versus volume, I use those interchangeably. But go back to that test I do, and that's across all genders, across all ages, across all experiences. When you speak up, you sound more interested in what you're saying and you sound more confident. And if I can insert something here, Aidan, something I learned only weeks ago, this theory called emotional contagion. This isn't even in the book. Emotional contagion. You can Google it, where there's research saying that when you're talking to someone and they're excited, so let's say I'm talking to you, Aidan, you're excited, I will want to mimic that excitement. So if you're smiling, I'll smile. If you're excited, I'll be excited. And because I'm mimicking it, I become excited. So basically, I will be as excited as you are. If you are not excited, I will not be excited. So that is a really great thing to think about when you know you need to not only make your point, but be the cheerleader for your point so that your audience can also be excited.
As I mentioned to you, I work as an MC sometimes at events, but actually the show is the best preparation you can ever get for that. Because as you know, and anybody who's been on the show, I do look at the person speaking and I nod and smile because I'm actually absorbing the content. And I don't have just a list of questions that I follow verbatim. And I think that's actually the death of so many conversations. And in particular, if you've ever been on the show, I remember always, do you remember Wayne's World, Joel?
Yes.
There's a scene where they go to the local radio station and they're being interviewed by the DJ and he's looking down and he's pressing all these sound effects and he's not listening to them. And they're like going, I could say anything to you, man. And he's like, I won't say what they actually call them. Google that one.
Right.
But it's great. But I always have that in my mind that it just breaks the connection between you and the speaker. You don't get to that extra level of depth. And as a result, you break that emotional contagion between you. And I think it's just such a secret sauce of any conversation is to be making eye contact and actually playing off what they're saying, not actually just following a script and going, yeah, I must ask my questions. I think that's just such a breaker. So speaking of breakers, and I thought we'd land the ship, and there's a specific point for this landing the ship. We'll talk about that in a second. We will actually finish with that. But before we do, is how to sharpen your point. So we know what the point is, I hope. We know how to tighten a point, deliver a point. We know how to pause around the point. But there's 4 specific tactics that help sharpen a point. And these alone, first, if we get the point, and then if you use these, you will be even a better writer as a result of that.
So one thing interesting I learned after coaching people about to make this higher value outcome when they make their points was that when their points ended with impacts on living things, on people, on animals, on customers, on clients, on society, on patients, it had more resonance with the people listening. There was more of a human to human connection. So what I also encourage now is when you end your point with an impact, bring in a living person. Is this affecting a human being somehow? Even if you're selling Coca-Cola, is it making someone happy or fulfilling their lives? When you mention that person, you include them in your impact, you just have a stronger, more memorable ending and a meaning and a value to what you're saying.
You mentioned that there's another one. There's 4 actually in the book, and we're going to let people get the book to do that. It's a really short read. I highly recommend it. It's one of those books. It's not just a read, it's a playbook. So you have to return to it, maybe check in with it every so often. And it's just really effective way to become a better communicator. But one I loved amongst the 4 there, and I guess it could be the one you chose as well, is badjectives, your own term.
Yes. Yeah. What I found, now this applies to writing as well. What I found is that we have an over-reliance on what I call badjectives. A badjective is an adjective and sometimes adverb that's so broad that it's virtually useless. It's a waste of a word. I often say, yesterday I had a very important, very valuable, and very meaningful tuna fish sandwich for lunch because I was hungry. I love tuna fish, and it meant a lot to me that day. Now, when I use the same words, meaningful, valuable, important, that I would use for a tuna fish sandwich, would I use that for a campaign or a huge game-changing marketing idea? I wouldn't. So we need to avoid these words. Very good, awesome, great is a word we hear all the time. This idea is great. Lots of things are great, and what's great to you may not be great to me. So to solve the badjective problem, we again introduce this word why. Why is it great? Oh, this idea is great because it'll save us money that we can apply toward R&D. Or this idea is great because it'll help us lose fewer files because they'll be kept in the cloud. Now you have a real reason. So you move from this idea is great to this idea is great because it will enable us to save our files. Now we don't even need the badjective anymore. So let's turn it from a 3-part to a 2-part. This idea will enable us to keep and better save our files. So you go right from the X to the Y, the means to the impact, and we don't even have to use that badjective of great at all. So this 3-step process: identify the badjective, great, very good. Could I apply this to a tuna fish sandwich? Then ask why and make that your point, and then remove the badjective. So now you just have a means and a real specific and meaningful impact.
And speaking of which, I'm holding up here the pin for those people just listening to us. It's the exclamation mark again. And I loved how you put this. So picture in your mind a gymnast going over the horse, and then where you see this so many times, I'm thinking of that movie where the girl has broken her ankle, straps it up, but still sticks the landing. That's the term I was grasping for earlier on. Sticks the landing
right,
perfectly. And sticking the landing is how to finish your presentation. It's how to make your point effectively. It's how to end a meeting. It's how to inspire a team. It's how, as an innovation or a corporate innovator, to inspire somebody to invest in your idea. Let's finish on sticking the landing.
We talked about recency, the power of recency. We talked about making the point the last thing you say. Sometimes people can say, okay, so I'll make my point. Then I'll talk about how they can get their parking stickers validated. Then I'll talk about where we're going for lunch. Well, listen, the last word is the last word before you walk away. Sticking the landing means saving all that stuff for the middle, even the Q&A. For the middle, you could even have 2 endings. So I hope you see how this idea is going to save the world. Then you do Q&A. Then you talk about the agenda. Then you say, before I leave, I just want to reinforce that without a point, everything you say could be pointless. So you restate it in a different way, but the bottom line is, before you walk away, the very last thing you should be doing is reinforcing your point, because that's the stickiest moment of your presentation.
Beautiful, man. And you didn't finish on up talking or anything. That's a little teaser. Check out the book to find out more about that. Joel, for
What's-
people who do want to reach out to you, people who want to invest in their people who are constantly selling ideas, where's the best place to find you?
I always direct people to my website, which is www.joelschwartzberg.net, JoelSchwartzberg.net. That's where I have my videos. I have all of this podcast and other podcasts I've been on. And one of the big reasons I like to send people there, not just to find out more about my books, but I've written hundreds of articles for Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Inc.com, Newsweek, and I put them all there. And all of the titles are very intuitive. So if you think you talk too quickly, if you think you don't know how to start a speech, if you think you're not being authentic or confident enough, how can you make your presentation better that way? You can almost look at this library of titles and find what most matches your need and then read those free articles.
And I'm not going to finish on that because I'm going to finish with you landing your point once again. I want to point to the, speaking of which, point to the library here behind me to point out Joel's 2 books. There's actually 3, so there's the updated version of Get to the Point there as well. It's a brilliant read.
Mhm.
I learned so much as a speaker, as an MC, as a podcaster, as a writer in this as well. And it's just always a pleasure to have you on the show, Joe. What is your last message to get the point across to our audience?
My last message, and I'm going to borrow from some media training here. In media training, there's always a last question. And the last question is often, so expert, anything else we missed or what else do you want to say? And that spokesperson will often think, all right, what's the 13th most important thing I want to say that I haven't said yet? Well, that's the wrong internal question. The right question is, how can I use this opportunity to reinforce the most important thing I said? Again, primacy and recency. So to you, Aidan, and to your audience, my message is make sure you're conveying your most valuable point and you're championing that point. That is the best way to make people feel, think, and do.
Author of The Language of Leadership and Get to the Point, Joel Schwartzberg. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I want to thank also our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.